Hi there. My name is Lucas Weiss, and I am the host of the Weesesports Quarantine Chronicles. For today's episode, I'm joined by Scott Powers. Scott is a Chicago Blackhawks writer for The Athletic. In this episode, I chat with Scott about his early journalistic assignments, covering all Chicago sports teams, transitioning from print to digital media, and his advice for young journalists. The Weesports Quarantine Chronicles is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. So make sure to like, rate, watch, and subscribe to all three of those channels. This is episode 39 of the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles. All right, on today's episode of the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles, I am joined by Scott Powers. He is a Chicago Blackhawks writer for The Athletic. Scott, thanks so much for coming on the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
Anytime. And Scott, I got to start because I'm from Toronto, Canada, and many, of my listeners have traveled to Chicago before, mainly for the deep dish pizza. But Chicago is a sports city. And for those of my listeners who may not know what it's like to live in Chicago and cover Chicago sports teams, why don't you just start off with what it's like to be in a big market covering Chicago sports where there's a lot of eyeballs that's on your content?
Yeah, no, it's exciting. I've worked my way up. I grew up in Chicago, so wanting to be a sports writer since I was in high school, and following a lot of the top writers and hoping someday to be one of them, and work my way up. Work for ESPN, and I'm with The Athletic. And one of the reasons The Athletic chose Chicago as its first market was because they felt it fit the criteria of having a market that, people are really passionate about sports. And sometimes you hear it in good ways, sometimes you hear it in bad ways, but it's really a market that it has a huge fandom. And if you have something to write and something interesting to say, they certainly listen. And it's an enjoyable market to work in. You surely know that people are reading your work, and having covered the Blackhawks for a while now, I feel like I've found my footing a little bit in this sport a little bit, where I certainly covered high school and colleges for a long time, and bounced around, and then finally found hockey, and wasn't always happy about covering hockey at ESPN, but it eventually embraced it, and now here I am, 7 years on the beat, or 8 years, whatever it is now. But it's good, and certainly the Blackhawks' success, I'm not a fan in any way myself, but I'm covering some Stanley Cups, and I'm sure some of that helps too, where that the fans and just the readership grows because of that as well.
And compared to a smaller market, Scott, I mean, being in a big market like Chicago, you mentioned how there's just a lot of fans watching, but there's a lot more coverage of a specific team like the Blackhawks or the many other Chicago sports teams. How do you stand out as a writer amidst all that noise?
Yeah, it's hard, especially early on. It was a struggle, and coming into a sport that I didn't have a lot of knowledge about, and certainly a beat that I didn't have any sources on, and so it took some time, but it's like any other, whether I was working for a small newspaper in Freeport, Illinois, or working for a major outlet, like I think you treat it the same, where one, you whatever you're covering, it's important. It has to be important to you, and you want to create interesting and insightful work, and you certainly try to cultivate sources, and then even though it's interesting going from ESPN, The Athletic, we didn't get credentialed initially, so it was trying to write, not only write, but also have people subscribe to an outlet that that didn't have access. So how do you exactly do that? And it forced me to have to think outside the box, and write in a different way, and certainly analyze games. And now, Mark Lazarus is also on the Blackhawks beat with me on The Athletic, and I feel like, we're competitive, so I think we want to, just do better work than the competition. And certainly if they have a big scoop, or if they do a big story, I think that drives us, but also that we know that people are now paying for our work, and and we're obviously prideful too. But I think those are all factors, and the fact that there is competition, I think it does. I think it really does help the market as a whole. I mean, people have choices, and you know that, and you know that you have to bring your gay game and bring interesting material if people are going to read it, and then especially being with the Athletic and being behind the paywall, that it takes something a little bit more for someone to pull out their credit card and pay for that work as well.
I want to get into your career. You're a graduate of Indiana University, home of the Hoosiers. And I'm just curious for you, I mean, was getting into sports media always in the cards for you? Is that what you wanted to do for your career?
Yeah, it's probably since my sophomore year of high school that I decided that this is what I wanted to do, and started focusing in on that. I started writing letters to my favorite sports writers when I was in high school, and even started freelancing a little bit for some local papers when I was in high school. And then going off to Indiana, and the first thing I did was go to the school paper and figure out how I can contribute there. And early on, you're writing about fencing and tag football or flag football, whatever it was, and you don't feel like you're making much of an impact, but you get your feet wet. And honestly, my parents paid a lot of money for me to go to IU, but most of my education came from working at the newspaper and getting just really learning the craft. Just from doing it. So from there, it was I worked for a couple of small newspapers out of college. Worked for it was a bi-weekly in Indiana. Covered some news. Covered some. It was actually during 9/11, so I covered the Indianapolis airport during that, and then moved to a small Freeport newspaper in Freeport, Illinois. And then I actually decided probably. I don't know if I do it under these times, but at that point I quit my job from Freeport and decided to open this e-magazine called Ill Hoops. And I covered high school basketball back in Chicago, and that was never really that successful. But looking back, it led to everything else where I learned how to I was running my own business. I was designing the publication. I was taking photos, videos, and then that led to an opportunity with the Chicago Sun-Times where I was doing a lot of that stuff too. Where I was freelancing for them, but making some decent money because they paid for videos and photos, and that actually led to ESPN calling me one day saying that they're opening up ESPN Chicago, and would you like to cover high schools? And I asked if I could also expand the job to covering colleges, and then it was it's kind of one door led to another. But when I'm looking back, I think this is a piece of advice I have for a lot of young journalists has been just learning to do as much as you can, because you never know how it's going to become useful. And I don't do as much video and photo now, but it certainly opened a lot of doors back then. And I never obviously expected to be a hockey writer, but here I am too. So the fact that I knew how to report, and I feel like I learned how to report on anything. I was able to embrace whatever was in front of me, and now I certainly I took the time to learn about hockey, and here I am. But it's been an interesting road. Probably not the one that I scripted or certainly thought was going to happen, but it's been fun, and it's I've been happy that I don't think I ever regret choosing journalism or going this way. There are a lot of ups and downs, but it's all been worth it.
Well, everyone's sports journalism journey, I mean, if you ask any journalist, is unique. It's winding. I had one of your athletic colleagues, Scott Burnside, on the show, and he was at different spots before where he is now. He was at ESPN at some time, and then now at the Athletic. And you made a couple really interesting points. One is about getting the reps. I think for a lot of young journalists, you just got to go out there and get the reps, get writing and doing a lot of the different tasks. I mean, you mentioned how you were shooting video, you were taking photos. The more versatile you are as a journalist, the better chances you are getting hired. And I also think, too, is taking some of those smaller beats, because, look, I think a lot of us have aspirations of, being a hockey writer covering the NHL. But sometimes in order to learn the ropes of the craft and the industry, you got to do some of those unique beats, like covering a fencing tournament, covering college sports, high school sports, in order to really develop those skills that you can then use going forward.
Yeah, I think part of it's you make mistakes, like you learn and you live and learn. And covering again, that Freeport experience out of college was so beneficial. I worked there for almost 2 years, and we had a pretty young staff, and we all kind of cut our teeth at the same point. But we were covering 20 plus high schools, and covering them like pro teams. That was our pro beat to us, and there's some things that I regret looking back, and some mistakes were made, but you learn from those as a 21, 22-year old, whatever it was, and but I feel like things that I do now as a Blackhawks beat writer are things that I learned back then, and part of it's cultivating those sources and people trusting you, and then doing interesting work and finding something outside the box, and just bringing a different angle to it. And yeah, just I don't know. There's so many different ways and so many different types of stories we write for the Athletic now too, and I think it's still pushing just the envelope a little bit, and the stories you do, and a lot of that does come from just experience and taking chances, and I think that's the greatest thing you can do as a young writer, is just taking as many chances as possible, and creating your voice, and whether you're working at a school paper, I think that's an opportunity automatically to write, and it gets a little bit harder. I don't know the journalism field as much as I did coming out of college myself. I know there are fewer small papers, and there's certainly a lot more blogs, and I think for me, and I know some people advise that you want to get paid regardless of what you write, but for me, I think really it is about the reps, and knowing in journalism that you probably won't make it rich. It's never been about the money to me. It's been about doing the job and enjoying this, and so I think any chance you can write, you can take photos, you can take video, and the fact that we do live in in these times where you can post things and have blogs yourself, and certainly ways to do things on social media and all this. I think all those can play to your advantage. It's a little bit harder to get published than maybe it was back in the day, in some ways for like a professional outlet, but I think the more that you can put time into it, and certainly create some clips, and then you can send it off to people. But I think the emphasis early on, especially, is taking risks and creating your voice, and trying to do something different than it's already out there. Because I think I think we've seen that people embrace coverage as long as it's interesting. So I think some of the best hockey writers even today are the people who've created their own coverage through blogs, and don't necessarily have the major platforms, but they've become relevant in other ways too. So I think there are a lot of ways to do this, and it doesn't always have to be the traditional route. So I think just putting the time and the work in, and just trying to think a little bit outside the box and be creative about it.
I want to talk about freelancing, because you've had the chance to, of course, freelance with a lot of different outlets in your career. And I find that for young writers, freelancing is, how you get, your byline out there, getting those reps like we talked about. But what are some of the traits or the skills that a freelancer needs to have in order to be successful in getting their work out there and getting eyes on their content?
I think one of it's being willing to do anything. When I got laid off from ESPN, I wasn't going to let ESPN decide when my journalism career was going to end. I was driven to. I didn't know what the next job was, and luckily the Athletic came around eventually. But I wanted to freelance for a while and give myself a chance to keep this going, and that meant just busting my ass a little bit. I think I worked for freelance for about 20 publications. Some of them paid pennies, and some of them paid decently. But it was, contacting basically any, if you can find anything on the web of a publication, that I was willing to reach out. And I certainly had friends in the industry that I could ask for, suggestions and recommendations, and putting in a good word for me, and that helped. And it certainly helped that I had written for ESPN, so I think it opened a few doors for me. Just when I email people out, but some of these places are certainly hungry and eager to find writers who want to write, and again, the pay is not always great, but it allows you to write some more. And I wrote about everything from Olympic sports to obviously hockey, and I did some for stuff, I think high school stuff for the Chicago Tribune, and I even did a little bit of stuff for ESPN, even though they laid me off. The money was decent, so I had some freelancing opportunities there. But I worked for a couple small scouting hockey things that I think they paid $25 a story, and it really wasn't a whole lot, but it was it was just like I'm gonna get my name out there and keep on working, and whatever money, obviously money was sort of important. I didn't have a kid then, but I needed to get by a little bit. But it was also about keeping busy and writing, and it certainly probably allowed me to allowed me to write about some different things too. And I think that's one of the things, if you're a freelancer, you got to be flexible about is whatever the story is. You probably need to educate yourself about it. There were a lot of stories that I had to go out and do the research and figure out what was going on in the sport, or just understanding the terminology and doing some research on the subject that the editor, publisher, whomever had recommended. So I think you put a lot of those tools to use, but just in a different way, and sometimes outside of an area that maybe it's outside your comfort zone. But I think the key is just reaching out to a lot of publications and asking if they need help, or if they do down the line, just sort of think of me and, can I pass my resume or some of my clips? And, I heard no often too. And I think that's part of it too, is just being used to knowing that rejection, it's not even rejection, it's just sometimes it's about the opportunities not being there. And I sort of recognize that myself too. So, and it really goes to the, back to, again, the work ethic and being slightly, at least aggressive enough where that, to be willing to put your name out there and see if you can get a couple bites.
You got your start in print, obviously, writing for newspapers. Then you made the transition over to digital media platforms like The Athletic. I'm just curious if you found that transition difficult, or was it pretty seamless for you to be able to then go from writing at a newspaper compared to now writing for a website?
No, it was probably pretty easy just because websites allow you the space, and it was probably harder when I was freelancing again after working at ESPN. Was all of a sudden I had to deal with inch counts and word counts, and people telling me that I needed to cut stories just to fit in the space, and that was a bit of a challenge just because I had been allowed usually the freedom to write as long as I wanted to, and that freedom is often it's a good thing, but for a writer it can also be a crutch, or me writing 2,000 words on something that could probably be condensed to 1,000 words is, sometimes I'm sure I overwrote, and even that's something at The Athletic I think we're conscious of, is that sometimes our stories are too long, and and what we're writing is not always exactly needed. So I think that's it's a good tool too, is that some of these places that do have restrictions, I think it allows you to condense what you're writing and figure out what's important. And I'm sure people go through my stories now and be like, that could have been a lot shorter, and something that I'm consistently trying to work on. But I think it was easier for me to go from your newspapers to web, also because it allowed the freedom of even now doing analysis with video, and I think you're seeing that a little bit more on newspaper websites now, but obviously it's not appearing in their print form. But I think it's there's a little bit more just freedom in the ways that sometimes you can cover a topic because of the web, and so it's and I do think other markets and other types of I think newspapers have kind of found that balance too. So it's at the end of the day, I also do miss newspapers and just having to hold something, and there's still something that's very nostalgic to me about holding a newspaper and seeing something designed and laid out like that. I do miss those days, and not having that kind of work be able to present anymore.
Well, you're a Chicago Blackhawks writer, and the last decade was, of course, very kind to the Chicago Blackhawks. 3 Stanley Cups in 6 years. Of course, they hadn't won a Stanley Cup, since 1961, and then that streak ended, of course, in 2010. They then won in 2013 and then 2015. You and your colleagues at The Athletic wrote a piece about recently, those 3, looking back at those 3 teams and which one was the most dominant. But what do you remember of that era, Scott? Because I just remember, for me, it was just so exciting to watch how Joel Quenneville, and the entire management team could put this team together, and the players were just relishing the opportunity to be one of the best teams in the NHL for that 6-year stretch.
Yeah, for me, I came on the beat in 2013, and again, I wasn't much of a hockey fan prior to that, so I don't even know if I had watched the 2010 Stanley Cup or not. I'm sure I did in some form, but I don't have like huge recollections of it. So it was coming on to hockey in 13, ESPN had basically told me that I'd become the Blackhawks beat writer, and it was a shortened season, and I hadn't done much research and wasn't really ready for it. And then they go on this long run, and they were a great team that season. So it was looking back, it was an interesting experience because I wasn't exactly covering that team, and then sort of embraced it after that. And then they won the cup a couple of years later, and so it was, and obviously it's been strange since that last cup in 15 that they haven't made the playoffs, and the team has been a bit of trending downward. So it's been kind of interesting to kind of cover them at their peak, and now seeing them probably at a much lower point than from that, and so trying to rebuild themselves again. So it's been as reported too. Again, it's I'm sure in some way that I benefit when the Blackhawks are successful, and it helps readership and all those things. But even for me, just covering a losing team has been interesting, and covering someone who has had a number 3 draft pick last year, and that's I think that it brought a different angle to the beat and something else different. I think we all enjoy covering the big events, but again, the Blackhawks win or lose, I'm going to write a story and try to be as objective as possible. So it's looking back, it was a neat time, and there was stress to covering some of those games and trying to get stories up quickly, and there's certainly a thrill in doing that. And then now it's different too, covering a team that's struggling, and but still trying to bring those unique stories to the site, and trying to tell those behind the scenes stories. And now it's interesting, they fired a president, and you had Joel Quenneville fired last year, and these changes and kind of change of guards interesting too. So it's overall it's kind of been an interesting 7-8 years on the beat, and an assortment of different stories to write about.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head, because I think a lot of beat reporters, they dream of course, that chance to cover a championship team, because the city is excited, and of course more eyeballs are on your content. But with some of the beat reporters I've had on this show, Scott, like, they also enjoy when a team isn't doing well, because oftentimes the players and the personnel are a lot more revealing, if you will, when a team isn't so hot, and it often leads to better stories. And it's a unique challenge. Like, you either want to be a really great team or a really lousy team. Sometimes the mediocrity isn't as good as having those two extremes as a writer.
Yeah, no, and that's a good point too. I think players are easier to deal with when they're winning, and a lot more open. But for the most part, covering hockey players, it's they're guys that usually give up their time and are willing to talk to you. And if you bring an interesting subject to them, they're usually willing to at least engage you. So I think looking back, I honestly think both have been have brought interesting stories for different reasons. And it's certainly easier at times to cover a winning team because people are more likely to talk, and the readership's there, and at some level we're driven by how large our audience is, and with the Athletic we see how many people read our stories, how many people are subbing, getting subscriptions off our stories. I think those are all factors too. But and it's been interesting. I guess I wasn't used to writing about a losing team or having a beat. I didn't have like a consistent beat before the Blackhawks. I covered a lot of different high schools and colleges, and bounced around on the Bulls and Bears as backup writers, and then they had my own beats. And so it's even now I feel like I'm still learning and still learning how to become a better hockey writer, and embracing more analytics and different ways to to write about the sport. So, and I think that's how I often gauge is my own journey, and just I feel like I'm a better hockey writer, this season than even compared to last season, and certainly 4 or 5 seasons ago. So I wish I almost had sort of this education before this, and then been able to write about the Stanley Cup teams, because I'm sure I could have put that even put that story together even better, and brought a more overall coverage. So it's for me, again, with me not having known much about hockey, it's been a learning process, and it was interesting covering a winning team when I wasn't as educated, and now that I am, I certainly feel a lot stronger, more confident in what I'm writing.
Of course, you mentioned about learning how to become a better hockey writer, and now you're faced with this new challenge of the NHL, looking like the return to play is going to happen, down, later this summer. The Chicago Blackhawks, if they do return to play, are going to be one of those 24 teams, and of course one of the teams in the play-in. But Scott, what are the challenges? What are the challenges going to be like for you as a hockey writer, trying to write about this team when it hasn't been confirmed yet? But I'm sure there's going to be restrictions to access, and who knows if you'll be in the arena or not. So I'm just curious what your thoughts on covering the return to hockey, which can be very exciting because it's historical, but also the challenges that come with that.
Yeah, it'll be different, and again, I go back to when we first started the Athletic, and not having access, it made you think outside the box, and I think it made me prepare for, the Blackhawks haven't given us access throughout this pause, so it's, we're producing stories without talking to players and management, and I feel like Mark Lazarus and I have done a pretty consistent job, and we're publishing 15, 20 stories a month still, and getting a lot of content up there, and I think for the most part it's been pretty interesting, and certainly we've looked at a lot of nostalgia kind of type pieces, and it certainly helps the 10-year anniversary of the Blackhawks winning the Cup kind of coincides with this. But I think the challenge of when hockey returns is trying to find unique angles when we're all probably having the same Zoom interviews, or the same interviews that just whatever access we get. I don't think there's going to be a lot of chance for one-on-ones, and I feel like we do some of our best work when there's one-on-one opportunities, and being able to just differentiate what you're doing out there, and kind of craft a unique angle. So I think that's one of the challenges that'll occur with this, and trying to find stories that your competition isn't writing, and just stories that are interesting that people want to read for, and again subscribe for, and so I'm curious what it all looks like. It's going to be a different world, and I'm not expecting to be allowed in the arena. I'm not expecting, I'm expecting there to be some sort of media access, but I don't know how that looks, and it'll probably happen, just the way that we're talking now. So, but you add 4 or 5 more, plus people on the call, and then getting in maybe a question or two if you're lucky. So, it'll be a different world, and but it's about adjusting, and just trying to again coming at it a different way, and so yeah, I don't know, I'm curious what this next few months look like, and how this all plays out, but it's definitely different and interesting, and it kind of pushes you as a writer.
Last question for you, Scott, the most important one. If you were to recommend a deep dish pizza place in Chicago to any one of my listeners who is visiting Chicago, what would it be and why?
I like Lou Malnati's is obviously one of the popular ones. I'm a big fan of their crust. There's a bunch of them. Yeah, I feel like you can't go wrong with Lou Malnati's. I'm blanking on names right now. I'll have to. I guess Malnati's at this point. Giordano's is good, and there's certainly a bunch of local places too. I mean, if people go on Yelp, I'm sure they can find better reviews than I'm obviously giving. But I think Malnati's, it's obviously one of the more popular ones, but I think it lives up to the hype.
Yeah, I mean, I've had Lou Malnati's before, and for anyone that's visiting Chicago, it definitely lives up to the hype. So make sure to check that out. But Scott Powers, he is the Chicago Blackhawks writer for The Athletic, writes a lot of really great content. And I just want to say thank you so much for providing even more insight and perspective here today on the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles.
Now, Lucas, I appreciate you having me on. Thank you.